Let's talk about speciation now, the evolutionary process in which species diverge and become new ones. What even is a species? In biology, for sexually reproducing organisms, we define a species as a bunch of critters that can potentially mate and produce fertile offspring. Think of it like having an all access genetic pass. If two individuals can share their genetic tickets and the next generation is viable and can have babies too, they belong to the same species. Exceptions, of course, exist. Life is messy, and sometimes closely related species do produce hybrids, but that usually means that they haven't fully split apart evolution wise. So, a species is a group of organisms that can naturally interbreed and produce fertile offspring, forming a distinct, reproductively isolated group. Speciation 101. If you imagine an evolutionary family tree, each branch split from an older line. See here, one ancestor split into two. That's speciation, when one species branches into two. You can see how modern elephants evolved from a common ancestor, the Paleomastodon. Paleomastodon, that's a complicated word. A species that lived in Egypt about 35 to 50 million years ago. It is the ancestor of both the modern Asian and the African elephant. Darwin famously illustrated this on The Origin of Species. This is actually the one figure here that he included in the book. For this branching to happen, two groups of the original population must break off, then change so much over time that they can't or won't interbreed anymore. They have become separate species. So, speciation is the evolutionary process where populations diverge and become distinct species, often due to the reproductive isolation leading to the formation of new species. There are two big ways a species can split. Allopatric speciation happens when a new species end up with different homelands. Allo means other, and patric means fatherland or native land. The word patriot comes from the same root as well. This happens when a population gets geographically separated. Maybe a river changes course or a mountain range pops up. Each isolated group evolves differently. Eventually, they've changed too much to mate if they ever meet up again. So, allopatric speciation is a mode of speciation where a population becomes geographically isolated, leading to the formation of new species due to the lack of gene flow between the separate groups. Now, contrast that with sympatric speciation, which happens when the new species end up in the same homeland. Sym means together. This one is trickier because the population stays in the same place, but subdivisions occur, maybe due to different food preferences or mating habits, for example. At some point, individuals don't interbreed anymore and two species are born out of one. So, sympatric speciation is when evolution of a new species where both continue to inhabit the same geographic region without any physical barrier to gene flow. Separation occurs due to different food preferences, mating habits, etc. Could more than two species split from one at the same time? Sure, in principle, but it's rare and tough to study in real time. So we generally think of it like a single branch that divides into two. If multiple splits happen around the same period, you can still visualize it as a rapid series of mini splits, which is basically a multi-branching scenario happening close together. The bottom line is that speciation is nature's way of creating biodiversity, like forging new paths from an old trail. Sometimes the process is straightforward, sometimes it's a little messy. Hello, hybrids. But that's what makes the evolutionary story so fascinating. One branching moment can set the stage for a whole new line of organisms. Talk about life getting creative. Let's talk about geographic separation, the driving force behind the allopatric speciation. When a population is spread over one continuous area, the different alleles or copies of a gene can intermingle freely. But when a river changes course or a canyon forms, suddenly blocking that free movement, well, two groups may become isolated from each other. Give them enough time apart, plus their own local environmental challenges, and they'll evolve along different paths. If they ever meet again, they might be so genetically different that breeding either doesn't happen or produces weak or even infertile offspring. And boom, we have two new species that got created. Why does that happen? It's because different mutations pop up in each isolated group, and natural selection plus some genetic drift pushes them in different directions. Maybe one side has more predators, so bigger body size or faster legs become favored. Meanwhile, the other side has a cooler climate, a different adaptation game. Over the generations, diverging features appear, and reproductive isolation can eventually get in the way of successful mating. We label these reproductive isolation barriers. Pre-zygotic mechanisms are all the reason mating doesn't even get to the fertilization step, like timing or reproduction, mismatched courtship rituals, or even just incompatible signals like incompatible pheromones. Pre means before, zygote is a fertilized egg. So that means we don't even fertilize an egg. In contrast, we have post-zygotic mechanisms, and in those, fertilization does happen. You see, the word post means after. The offspring might not develop properly, though, or they might be sterile. Remember the mules we talked about? The hybrid of a male donkey and a female horse? It's sterile. So, there it is. So in pre-zygotic barriers prevent fertilization from occurring, while post-zygotic barriers reduce the viability or reproductive capacity of a hybrid offspring after fertilization. These mechanisms lock in the separation between the two species. So isolation can happen through natural barriers like a forming lake or a newly built valley, or a few adventurers drifting off on a raft of vegetation to a distant island with no way home. Note that the specifics depend on the species. Flying insects might hop over a valley with ease, but rodents might be cut off by a simple lake. We break down allopatric processes into two flavors. Either a few members of a species move to a new area, or a new natural barrier divides the organisms. In dispersal movement, a subset of the population packs up and moves away, like the Darwin's finches heading off to a new island. In contrast, in vicariant movement, something in nature divides the group, like a glacier or a newly formed canyon. The Latin word for vicarius means substitute. So, dispersal describes the movement of organisms to new areas, while vicariance refers to the splitting of a species range due to the formation of a geographic barrier. As a real-life example, we see the northern and Mexican subspecies of the spotted owl on the U.S. West Coast. You see here the northern owl, the spotted owl, and then the Mexican spotted owl like here. And you can see how differently they look, possibly Glaciers during an ice age split an older population into two. And here's the clincher. The further apart those two groups are, physically and environmentally, the more likely they evolve into distinct species. Adaptive radiation is a special scenario where one species migrates and spreads out into multiple niches. This often happens in island archipelagos, like the Hawaiian Islands. Each new habitat has its own demands, prompting the ancestral species to split again and again. The Hawaiian honeykeeper is a textbook example. Here is an ancestor right in here of the Hawaiian honeykeeper. You get a whole suite of birds, each with a custom-made beak. Some are good for cracking tough nuts, like this one looking thing. Others are sipping nectar, and you see here there's a bunch of them that are good at sipping nectar. And then some are good at spearing insects. Whoosh, that's how they can get insects. Look at this long beak right here. That's good for insects as well. Darwin's finches had a similar story to tell in the Galapagos Islands. They also adapted very uniquely. Essentially, geographic isolation and time and natural selection gives rise to new species. If you ever find yourself on a remote island teeming with curious creatures found nowhere else, you're likely witnessing the results of that same branching speciation process playing out over millions of years. Nature's creativity in action. Let's talk now about what happens when species don't geographically separate.